I bought a $2 lottery ticket at a regular store on my way home from work, and 2 days later, when I checked the numbers at my kitchen table, I realized I had won $72 million. I had never won anything like that in my life. I had barely won anything at all. But when I called the number I found to confirm the prize, the woman on the other end of the line did not congratulate me. She went quiet for a moment, and then she said 3 words that changed everything. "This isn't possible."
My name is Donna Pruitt. At the time, I was 48 years old, divorced for 6 years, and working the morning shift at a regional pharmacy distribution warehouse outside Tulsa, Oklahoma. My job was not glamorous. I checked inventory manifests against shipment counts for $11 above minimum wage, standing on concrete floors under fluorescent lights while other people's boxes moved past me all day. I lived alone in a rented 2-bedroom place on the east side of town, and most evenings were quiet, in the way a life gets quiet when no one is waiting at the door anymore. Laundry, dishes, half-watched television, a phone call every now and then with my son Tyler, who was 23, living 2 hours away in Oklahoma City, working construction and trying to save enough money for a place of his own. I was not someone who played the lottery regularly. Maybe 4 or 5 times a year, when the jackpot got big enough that everybody started talking about it at gas stations and break rooms. The number would get so large that it stopped feeling like money and started feeling like a story, something impossible that happened to other people, while the rest of us still counted dollars at the grocery store. That Friday in April, I stopped at the Quick Stop on Route 9 after a double shift. I was tired, in the deep, specific way that comes from being on your feet for 10 hours and still having to drive yourself home. I bought a coffee, a candy bar, and on impulse, one $2 Powerball ticket. I did not let the machine choose the numbers. I picked them myself. My birthday, Tyler's birthday, 3 other numbers that looked right to me when I wrote them down on the slip. Nothing about that moment felt special. Nothing about it announced itself as the beginning of anything. Curtis, the clerk behind the counter, rang everything up the way he always did. I had seen him there for at least 2 years. He was friendly enough, mid-30s ordinary, in the way people become ordinary when you only know them through brief counter conversations. I paid, took my coffee and candy bar and ticket, and drove home. I did not think about the ticket again until Sunday morning. I want to be honest about how plain that moment was, because people imagine winning the lottery as something cinematic. They imagine screaming, crying, dropping to the floor, calling everyone they know. For me, it started with coffee going cold on my kitchen table, and my thumb scrolling through the drawing results on my phone, because I had always checked numbers I assumed would lose. I read the winning numbers once. Then I read them again, slower. Something in my chest went very still and very loud at the same time. I got up and found the ticket in the side pocket of my purse, where it had been sitting forgotten for 2 days. I checked the numbers against my phone. Then I checked them again. Then I checked them a 3rd time, because my hands had started shaking so badly, I had to set my phone down on the table. All 5 white balls matched. The Powerball matched, too. For a long time, I just sat there. I do not know how long, because time stopped acting like time. My mind tried to find any explanation other than the obvious one. Maybe I had the wrong date. Maybe the website had glitched. Maybe I was looking at an old drawing. Maybe I had misunderstood the rules. I checked the date on the ticket against the date of the drawing 4 separate times. They matched, every time. The jackpot for that drawing was listed at $72 million. I did not call anyone right away. I sat with it first. There are some things too large to understand immediately, and I had to turn this one over in my mind, looking for the seam where it might not be real. Eventually, I did what I assume most people would do. I searched for the official number to verify and claim a lottery prize in Oklahoma, and I called it, with hands that still had not fully steadied. The call connected to a recorded message first. It was generic and automated, directing me through a menu. I pressed the option for prize verification. After a short hold, a woman came on the line. Her voice was pleasant, professional, and completely ordinary.
I gave her the ticket numbers. I gave her the drawing date. I told her, with my voice catching a little, that I thought I might have won. I said I was not sure, but I thought I had the winning ticket. There was a pause on the other end. Not a long pause, just long enough for me to notice it. Then she said, "This isn't possible." I asked her to repeat herself because I genuinely thought I had misheard. "This isn't possible," she said again. This time there was something careful in her tone. It sounded less like confusion and more like she was reading from a script she had never expected to need. She told me she needed to transfer me to a supervisor and asked me not to hang up. I sat on hold for nearly 4 minutes staring at the ticket in my hand, staring at my own handwriting on the numbers I had chosen. I kept wondering what exactly was not possible. Had I misunderstood the rules? Was there some technical disqualification? Was the ticket invalid? Had something gone wrong at the store? When the supervisor came on the line, his voice was measured in a way that felt rehearsed. He introduced himself as Mr. Whitcomb. He did not give a first name. He asked me to read the ticket numbers to him directly, even though I had already given them to the verification agent. I read them slowly and carefully. Then he asked where exactly I had purchased the ticket. I told him it was the Quick Stop on Route 9 just outside Tulsa. There was another pause. Then he said, "Ma'am, I'm going to be honest with you. There is an issue with that retailer's terminal reporting for that drawing date. We're seeing a discrepancy in the system. I can't confirm anything right now, and I would ask that you not make any public statements or contact media until this is resolved." I asked him what kind of discrepancy. He said he was not able to discuss specifics over the phone. He said someone would be in touch. That was it. No claim number, no case reference, no timeline, nothing except a vague promise that someone would follow up. When I asked for a direct number to call back, he gave me one, but later that same evening when I looked it up, it did not match any official extension listed on the Oklahoma Lottery Commission's public website. After the call ended, I stayed at the kitchen table with the ticket in front of me and my coffee cold beside it. My first real feeling was not triumph. It was not even disbelief about the money itself. It was fear. A colder, more practical fear. The kind of fear that comes from spending your whole adult life being careful with money because you have never had enough to be careless. Over the years, I had read stories about scams targeting lottery winners, stories about retailers swapping tickets, stories about clerks claiming prizes that belonged to customers. The phone call I had just had did not feel like an official verification process. It felt like someone buying time. I thought about the Quick Stop. I thought about Curtis behind the counter. I had no reason to believe anything bad about him, but a discrepancy in the system tied to that retailer's terminal was not a phrase that made me feel safe. So I made myself slow down. I am not an impulsive person. 11 years of inventory work teaches you to double-check everything before you trust a number. I was not going to let panic make my decisions for me. The first thing I did was photograph the ticket from every angle. I made sure the numbers were clear. I made sure the barcode was visible. I photographed the purchase date, the timestamp, and the retailer information printed at the bottom. Then, I emailed those photos to myself and uploaded them to my personal cloud storage so they were time-stamped before I did anything else. The second thing I did was call Tyler. He listened to the entire story without interrupting. He'd learned over the years to let me talk through a problem out loud before trying to solve it. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Mom, do not go back to that gas station. Do not talk to that Whitcomb guy again by yourself. I think you need a lawyer before you do anything else." It was almost exactly what I had already begun to suspect. But hearing him say it made it feel less like paranoia and more like a plan. That night before I went to bed, I searched for attorneys in Tulsa who handled lottery and gaming law. I had not even known that was a real area of legal practice until that evening, but it turned out to exist for exactly the kind of situation I seemed to be in. I found a small firm with a partner named Renata Voss. According to the firm's website, she had handled 3 previous disputed lottery claims in Oklahoma.
I left a message, even though it was Sunday, because I had a feeling that whatever was happening with that ticket was not going to wait politely for business hours. Renata called me back first thing Monday morning before I had even left for work. She had a brisk, no-nonsense way of speaking that made me feel steadier almost immediately. After I told her about the call with Mr. Whitcomb, she said, "Do not call that number back. Do not go anywhere near that retailer without me. I want to see the ticket, the photos you took, and I want you to write down everything that was said on that call, as close to word for word as you can remember before more time passes and the details blur." I took a half day off work that afternoon, which was something I almost never did, and met her at her office. Tyler had insisted. By then, I agreed with him that the situation deserved more attention than I could give it between inventory shifts. Renata's office was small and practical, nothing like the marble and glass law firms you see on television. There was an old coffee maker in the corner and stacks of case files on the windowsill. She looked like someone who worked more than she advertised. She studied the photos of the ticket under a desk lamp for a long time, comparing the barcode and printed information against something on her laptop. Finally, she said, "The ticket itself looks legitimate. Sequential numbering is correct, retailer code is correct, timestamp is consistent with that store's terminal. I do not see anything here suggesting fraud on your end." Then she looked up at me. "That makes the response you received very strange. If there were a genuine system discrepancy, the standard procedure would be to tell you an investigation was underway and provide a case number, a timeline, and a direct point of contact. Not a vague, 'someone will call you,' and a phone number that does not match official commission lines." I asked her what she thought was actually happening. She was quiet for a moment, choosing her words carefully. She said there were two possibilities. One was that there was a legitimate technical issue with that terminal and that the response I had received was bureaucratic clumsiness rather than anything sinister. The other possibility was that someone at that retailer location had a reason not to want my ticket to be the winning ticket. She said she had seen cases where a clerk or store owner tried to substitute a ticket claiming a prize was won on a different unsold ticket they controlled. She told me it was rarer than people imagined, but that it did happen, especially when the prize was large enough to change lives. I felt something cold settle in my stomach. I told her the clerk's name was Curtis. I did not know his last name. I had seen him there for a couple of years. He had always seemed friendly enough. I had never had a reason to think twice about him. Renata said she would file a formal inquiry directly with the Oklahoma Lottery Commission's main office, not through the extension Whitcomb had given me. She said she would request the retailer's terminal logs for that drawing date. Lottery terminals keep detailed transaction records, timestamps, ticket sequence numbers, void logs, reissue logs, employee IDs. If something had been altered or substituted, it would show up there. She said data did not lie the way people could. We filed the formal inquiry that same afternoon. Renata attached my photos, my written timeline of the weekend, and a formal request for the commission to investigate the terminal records independently of whatever internal process Mr. Whitcomb's supposed office was running. It took 3 days to get a response. When one came, it was not from Whitcomb. It came from the Oklahoma Lottery Commission's actual compliance office, from a woman named Director Patricia Schumacher. Her tone on the phone with Renata was completely different from what I had heard before. Sharper, more efficient, faintly alarmed in a way that confirmed something had truly gone wrong. Renata told me afterward that Director Schumacher had asked almost immediately whether I had spoken to anyone in the media. Renata thought that question said a lot by itself. It meant the commission already understood that what we had reported was serious. The terminal logs from the Quick Stop told a story I had not expected. On the night of the drawing, before the winning numbers were even publicly announced, the store's terminal recorded an attempted void and reissue on a ticket matching my exact numbers. The action had been initiated from an employee terminal, not from a customer kiosk. The void had failed for reasons the logs did not fully explain at first, possibly a system timeout, but the attempt itself was there. It had a timestamp. It had an employee ID. The employee ID belonged to Curtis Dunlap, the clerk who had sold me my ticket. Renata told me this over the phone. her voice carefully neutral in the way professionals manage when they have to deliver something significant. She said, "Donna, someone tried to cancel and reissue your winning ticket the same night the numbers were drawn before the public announcement. That is not a system glitch. That is an attempted substitution. Someone working that counter knew or suspected that the ticket they had just sold was the winner and tried to take it back." I stood in my kitchen with the phone pressed to my ear, the silence of the room suddenly feeling loud around me. I asked why the void had failed. Renata said she did not know yet, but she intended to find out. Then she told me this changed everything. We were no longer dealing with bureaucratic confusion. We were dealing with someone who had actively tried to take $72 million away from me. Her next move was to formally request that the Lottery Commission place an administrative hold on the prize, pending a full investigation. That would prevent the funds from being released to anyone, including any competing claimant, until the matter was resolved. The commission agreed within a day. The terminal log discrepancy was enough grounds for the hold. Renata told me it was exactly the outcome we wanted. It meant the commission officially recognized that something irregular had happened and that the prize itself was protected while they investigated. What I did not anticipate was how quickly Curtis Dunlap would find out the terminal logs had been pulled. Renata later guessed that someone in the commission's regional office, maybe a clerk processing the request, had mentioned it to a colleague who knew Curtis personally. The kind of small-town leak that happens without any real malice behind it. Just carelessness in a place where everyone seems to know someone connected to everyone else. It unsettled me more than I expected. I realized how thin the wall was between an official investigation and the person being investigated. Curtis called me directly on a Wednesday evening. The number was not one I recognized. I answered anyway, some instinct telling me I should hear whatever this was instead of letting it go to voicemail and sitting with it. He said Mrs. Pruitt. His voice had none of the easy counter-friendliness I remembered from 2 years of buying coffee and the occasional ticket at his store. Then he said, "I think we should talk before this gets out of hand." I told him I thought we were already past that point. He said there had been a mix-up that night. He said he had sold a similar ticket to someone else earlier in the shift and thought maybe he had given me the wrong one by mistake. He said he was only trying to fix an error. He said he had not been trying to steal anything. I asked him why, if that was true, he had not called the commission directly and explained the mistake. I asked why he had tried to void my ticket through his own terminal without telling me anything was wrong. There was a pause. When he spoke again, the apology had hardened into something else. He said, "You do not understand what this means for me. If it comes out that I tried to void a winning ticket, I lose my job, maybe worse. I have 2 kids. I need you to tell the commission it was a simple mistake, a misunderstanding, nothing intentional. You are about to have $72 million. What does it cost you to help me keep my job?" I told him it would cost me lying to a state agency about evidence in an active investigation, and I was not going to do that. His voice sharpened. He said, "You think anyone is going to believe a gas station clerk over you? I know people, Mrs. Pruitt. I know people who can make your life a lot more complicated than it already is. You really want to drag this out in public? You really want reporters asking why your ticket almost got voided the same night you won?" Even as he said it, I recognized it for what it was. An empty threat dressed up as a real one. The kind of thing a frightened, cornered person says when he has run out of better options. But it still landed cold in my chest the way threats do, even when some calmer part of you knows what they are. I kept my voice as level as I could. I said, "Curtis, I am going to hang up now. Then I am going to tell my attorney exactly what you just said to me. I encourage you to talk to your own lawyer before you say anything like this to anyone else." Then I hung up. My hands were shaking again, just as they had been that first Sunday morning. But underneath the shaking was something steadier than before, a kind of resolve I had not fully found in myself until I needed it. I called Renata immediately and told her the conversation in as much detail as I could remember.
She told me to write it all down that night while it was fresh and to send her the call log showing the time and duration from my phone records. She also asked gently whether I wanted her to request police involvement given the explicit threat. I told her I was not ready to go that far yet. I wanted to see whether the commission's own process could contain this before we escalated further. Renata said the call was useful, in a strange way. An employee attempting to pressure a prize claimant into mischaracterizing evidence was itself a serious issue. She said she would notify the commission's investigators about it the next morning. She did. Within 2 days, the commission's internal investigators opened a formal inquiry into Curtis Dunlap's conduct, separate from, but connected to, the terminal log discrepancy. Renata told me the gas station's franchise owner had also been notified, as required under the commission's retailer agreements, and that Curtis had been suspended from his position pending the outcome. For nearly a week after that, everything went quiet. No more calls from Curtis. No further word from the mysterious Mr. Whitcomb. The number he had given me had never been a legitimate extension at all. Director Schumacher confirmed that no employee by that name existed in the commission's verification department. That meant either Curtis or someone connected to him had impersonated a lottery official during that first phone call, hoping to delay me and discourage me before I sought outside help. During that quiet week, I finally allowed myself to do something besides document worry and wait. I told my supervisor at the warehouse I needed a few personal days, and I drove down to Oklahoma City to see Tyler. We did not talk about lawyers or terminal logs the whole time. We grilled burgers in his small backyard. We watched a baseball game neither of us cared much about. I slept more soundly those 3 nights than I had in the 2 weeks since buying that ticket. I came back to Tulsa rested and steadier, with a voicemail waiting from Renata. She said the investigation had reached a point where I needed to come in and hear what they had found. Her office looked the same as it had the first time I sat across from her, but I felt different walking into it, less frightened, more grounded. It felt like I had already survived the worst version of the thing I had been afraid of. Renata slid a folder across the desk and told me the commission's investigators had finished reviewing the terminal logs and store footage. Curtis Dunlap had sold a ticket to himself in a separate transaction 20 minutes before selling mine. When the numbers were announced and he realized my ticket was the winner, he tried to void my sale and reissue the winning ticket under his own purchase instead. The void failed because the system required manager-level authorization for any void above a certain dollar threshold during active drawing periods. It was a security feature Curtis apparently did not know existed. Renata told me that if the safeguard had not been there, there was a real chance I never would have known any of this happened. The system might simply have shown his ticket as the winner. I sat there for a long moment, thinking about the randomness of it. A security threshold neither Curtis nor I had known about had stood quietly between me and losing everything. It did not feel exactly like luck. It felt like the result of someone, somewhere, building a system carefully enough that it caught what it was supposed to catch. I asked Renata how often this kind of thing happened. I wanted to know whether I had simply been unlucky to run into it, or whether it was more common than most winners ever realized. She said it was more common than people assumed. Most winners never found out because most attempted substitutions succeeded quietly. I was one of the rare ones who had seen the mechanism fail. I asked what would happen to Curtis. Renata told me he had been terminated from his position, and the franchise owner had barred him from the property entirely. The commission was referring the matter to the district attorney's office for possible charges, including attempted fraud, and the impersonation angle if investigators confirmed he had been behind the first call as Mr. Whitcomb. That part would become a separate criminal matter outside our hands. Then she told me my prize hold would likely be lifted within 2 weeks, pending final administrative sign-off. She said I needed to start thinking seriously about how I wanted to receive the money, lump sum or annuity, and who I wanted managing it once it arrived. I left her office that afternoon with something I had not expected to feel yet. Cautious relief. Not celebration, not joy. Just the sense that the worst of the danger might have passed, even though the practical work of claiming the prize was still ahead of me.
2 days later, I got another call from a number I did not recognize. This time it was a man who identified himself only as a family friend of the Dunlops. He asked whether I would consider writing a character statement to the district attorney on Curtis's behalf. He said Curtis was a good father, a hard worker, someone who had made one terrible mistake under pressure and did not deserve to have his entire future destroyed over a moment of panic. The man spoke quickly, almost rehearsed, the way people do when they have been asked to make a call they are not entirely comfortable making. I told him politely but firmly that I was not in a position to advocate for or against criminal charges, and that any communication about the case needed to go through the proper legal channels, not directly through me. He did not push. The call ended quickly, almost as if whoever had asked him to call had not expected anything else. I told Renata the same day. She called it a soft approach, low pressure compared to what Curtis had tried himself. She said it was likely someone testing whether sympathy could accomplish what threats had not. That evening I called my sister Marlene in Wichita. I had not told her the full story yet, mostly because I had not wanted to say it all out loud until I understood it myself. But now that the investigation was essentially concluded and the danger seemed mostly behind me, I told her everything. The ticket, the strange phone call, Curtis, the terminal logs, the threats. Marlene was quiet for a while. Then she said, "Donna, you have been carrying all of this by yourself for 2 weeks." I told her I had Tyler and the lawyer. She said, "That is not the same as having your sister." There was something in her voice that was not hurt exactly, just honest. It made me realize how much I had isolated myself without meaning to. I had been treating the whole thing like a problem to be solved quietly, instead of something I was allowed to lean on people for. Marlene drove down from Wichita that weekend, 3 hours each way, just to sit at my kitchen table and hear the whole story, properly, in person, the way it deserved to be told. We talked late into the night in the kind of unhurried way that never works the same over the phone. She asked the small, ordinary questions that mattered more than I expected. What Curtis had sounded like, whether I was sleeping, whether Tyler was handling it as well as he claimed. For the first time since that Sunday morning with my coffee going cold, I felt like what had happened to me was something I could actually share, instead of something I had to manage alone. Curtis Dunlap came to my house himself the following Tuesday. I had not expected that. He had been barred from the store. The commission's investigation was already moving toward the district attorney's office. But I recognized his truck before I recognized him, parked at the curb in front of my rented duplex. For a moment, I considered not answering the door at all. I answered anyway. Marlene had gone home the day before, and as I crossed my living room, I told myself I was not going to let fear decide whether I faced something directly. I also remember thinking how strange it was that I had spent 2 years exchanging small talk with this man across a counter without ever imagining a version of him standing on my porch like that. He looked different than he had behind the counter. Thinner, somehow. Unshaven, wearing a flannel shirt that looked slept in. He asked if he could come in for just a few minutes and said he was not there to cause trouble. I left the door open behind me and stood in my own living room instead of sitting down. At the time, that felt important, even if I could not have explained why. I noticed, almost clinically, how much smaller he seemed than the confident man who had rung up my coffee for years. I wondered whether that smallness was real or just another performance, calibrated this time for sympathy instead of authority. He started by saying he was not there to threaten me. He said he knew how the last call had sounded. He said he had not been himself. He had been scared. Then he looked at the floor and told me he had 2 kids, 6 and 9. Their mother had left 2 years earlier, and it was just him. If he was charged with a felony, he said he would lose everything. Not only the job, but the apartment, maybe even custody. He said he was not asking me to lie. He just wanted to know if there was anything I could say that might help the district attorney see it as one bad decision instead of who he really was. It was a softer version of the same request the family friend had made over the phone. Different packaging, same ask. I found myself almost admiring, in a distant and uncomfortable way, how quickly he had recalibrated once threats failed. I told him I understood he was frightened. I said anyone would be facing what he was facing. But I also told him what scared me was not that he had made one bad decision under pressure. What scared me was that the decision he made was to try to take something that belonged to me, quietly, without telling me, hoping I would never find out. I told him that was not a moment of panic. It took thought. It took knowing the system well enough to try to use it. His jaw tightened. He said I did not know what that job paid. I did not know what it was like to watch someone walk in off the street and win $72 million on a $2 ticket, while he had worked that counter for 6 years and never gotten ahead of anything. I told him quietly that I understood more about not getting ahead than he might guess. I had worked on a warehouse floor for 11 years checking other people's shipments. I had raised my son mostly alone after my marriage ended. I knew what it was like to watch money move past me without ever quite reaching me. But I told him that was exactly why I would not pretend what happened was smaller than it was. If I told the district attorney's office that this was a misunderstanding and he did it again to someone else, someone with less support than I had, someone who might not catch it, then that would be on me too. His voice rose then. The soft, wounded framing fell away. He said, "So that is it. You are going to let them destroy my life over a ticket you did not even know you had won until Sunday morning." I told him I was not going to lie for him. That was different from destroying his life. What happened next was between him, the district attorney, and whatever judge heard the case. I was not deciding his sentence. I was simply refusing to help build a story that was not true. He stood there for a long moment. I watched something in his face shift from desperate negotiation into bitterness. Then he said, "You will regret this. People like you always think you are better than people like me. You will see how that money changes everything, and you will not even remember my name in 5 years." I walked toward the still open door and told him maybe he was right. But I also told him I would remember that night, and I thought that mattered more than he expected. He left without another word. His truck pulled away faster than it needed to, the tires catching gravel at the curb in a way that sounded angrier than anything he had actually said. I stood in the doorway for a moment after the sound faded, half expecting him to circle back. The street stayed quiet. I closed the door, locked it, and stood with my back against it while the adrenaline finally caught up to me. I called Renata immediately and told her everything. She told me calmly to write it down exactly as I remembered it, and to consider asking the commission whether a no-contact directive could be formally requested, since Curtis had now approached me twice outside proper channels. That night, sitting alone in my living room, I let the fear move through me fully for the first time since his visit. Fear that he might escalate. Fear that some version of this might never fully end. But underneath it was something that felt increasingly like conviction. I had been asked twice now to shrink the truth so someone else's consequences could become smaller. Twice, I had said no. I intended for that to remain true. The preliminary hearing was held 5 weeks later at the Tulsa County Courthouse, a plain municipal building that felt almost absurdly ordinary, considering everything that had led us there. Curtis had been formally charged with attempted fraud and impersonation of a state official. The impersonation charge confirmed what investigators had traced the original Mr. Whitcomb call had come from a burner phone, purchased with cash the same weekend as the drawing. Its call records matched the timing of my first conversation about the ticket. I arrived with Renata. Tyler had driven up from Oklahoma City the night before and sat beside me in the gallery. His presence steadied me in a way that reminded me of how he used to sit beside me in waiting rooms when he was a child, quiet and watchful, long before either of us imagined a courtroom would ever be part of our lives. Marlene came too, sitting just behind us. I was grateful in a way I had not expected for how much smaller everything felt
with people near me who were not strangers. Before the proceedings started, I glanced around the courtroom and thought how strange it was that a $2 ticket had brought all of us into the same room, dressed slightly more formally than usual, waiting on something none of us could have predicted a month earlier. The state's case was built carefully around the terminal logs, the failed void authorization, the burner phone records, and Curtis's two separate approaches to me, first by phone and then in person. Renata had documented both on the same day they occurred. The prosecutor walked through the timeline methodically. The attempted ticket substitution on the night of the drawing, the impersonation call designed to delay and discourage me, the later pressure to characterize his actions as an innocent mistake. When it was my turn to testify, I described what had happened plainly without embellishment. I reported it the way I had learned to report a discrepancy on a shipping manifest. Just the facts, in order, without editorializing. Renata had suggested I focus on a spot on the back wall while I spoke, so my eyes would not drift toward Curtis at the defense table and shake my composure mid-sentence. Curtis's attorney was a young public defender who looked like he had been handed the case without much preparation time. He tried to suggest that my account of Curtis's visit to my home might have been exaggerated, that grief and financial stress could make a person remember words as harsher than they actually were. He asked whether it was possible that what I interpreted as pressure had simply been a desperate man expressing genuine remorse. I told him it was possible, but I had written down exactly what was said the same evening before I had any reason to shape it for a courtroom. I had given those notes to my attorney within hours, both times Curtis contacted me. I told him the court was welcome to compare my notes to my testimony. He did not pursue that line much further. Then the prosecution introduced something I had not been told about in advance. Renata later said she had learned it only days earlier and had decided not to mention it until it was confirmed. Investigators reviewing Curtis's financial records as part of the fraud charge had discovered that this was not actually an isolated incident. 2 years earlier, at a different store location before he transferred to the Route 9 quick stop, a smaller prize of just under $4,000 had been claimed, under unusually similar circumstances. A customer's winning ticket had been voided and reissued under an employee account. The original customer had never been informed that anything had gone wrong. That case had never been investigated because the amount had been too small to trigger the same security threshold that protected my much larger prize. The courtroom went very still during that testimony. Curtis's composure, which had held through most of the hearing in a kind of sullen silence, finally cracked. He leaned toward his attorney and whispered something urgent. His voice was low, but audible enough for the judge to ask both of them to keep their exchange inaudible to the gallery. His attorney's expression shifted from routine defense posture to something more careful, more concerned. It was the look of someone realizing his client had not told him the full scope of what he was dealing with. The judge reviewed the new financial records now entered into evidence and asked the prosecutor directly whether the state intended to pursue additional charges related to the earlier incident, since it suggested a pattern rather than a single moment of panic. The prosecutor said they did and requested a broader review of Curtis Dunlap's employment history across both retail locations. There was a long pause. Curtis's attorney requested a brief recess. His voice sounded noticeably different than it had 20 minutes earlier. In its quiet, procedural way, it was the sound of a defense built on sympathy giving way under the weight of evidence that had nothing to do with sympathy. The recess lasted nearly an hour. When the court reconvened, Curtis's attorney informed the judge that his client wished to enter a plea rather than proceed to a full trial. It became clear that the discovery of the earlier incident had changed the entire case. What he had tried to frame as one desperate act had become a demonstrated pattern of behavior. The judge did not simply accept the plea and move on without comment. She addressed Curtis directly and noted for the record that the evidence suggested this was not an isolated lapse in judgment. It appeared to be a method he had used before, successfully against someone with far less at stake than I had. Someone whose $4,000 prize had likely never been recovered. Someone who, as far as anyone in that courtroom knew, still had no idea what had happened to it. The judge ordered the earlier case reopened for investigation, with an effort made to identify and notify the original ticket holder. She also noted that the Commission's failure to flag the earlier incident at the time was itself something worth internal review. I noticed Director Schumacher seated near the front of the gallery writing something quickly in her notebook when the judge said that. I watched Curtis's face during that part. Whatever defiance had carried him through his visit to my living room weeks earlier was gone. What remained was someone smaller than the man who had stood in my doorway, promising I would regret standing my ground. He did not look at me as the proceedings continued. I found that I did not need him to. As I watched him being walked out afterward with his attorney, I thought about his 2 children, waiting somewhere for a father whose choices had reached places far beyond him. I felt something more complicated than victory settle into the space where I had expected relief to be. Tyler must have seen something on my face because he leaned over and quietly asked if I was all right. I told him I was, and I mostly meant it. Marlene reached forward from the row behind us and squeezed my shoulder. It was a small gesture, but somehow it carried more weight than anything said out loud in that courtroom. Under the terms of his plea, Curtis was sentenced to 18 months. Restitution was ordered for the attempted fraud against me, and pending the outcome of the reopened earlier case for the original $4,000 prize, if the rightful winner could be located. He was also permanently barred from any employment connected to lottery retail sales in the state of Oklahoma. The impersonation charge connected to the burner phone added a separate fine and a formal record that would follow him, regardless of how the rest of his life unfolded. Renata told me afterward that the sentence was harsher than she had expected for a first-time offender, and that the judge's comments on the record suggested she had been genuinely troubled by the pattern of behavior rather than treating it as a single lapse. She also mentioned that the public defender had quietly admitted outside the courtroom that he wished his client had told him about the earlier incident before it surfaced through the prosecution, instead of after. The administrative hold on my prize was lifted that same week. Renata walked me through the final paperwork with the same brisk efficiency she had shown from the beginning. Within days, the actual claims process began in earnest. Verification, tax documentation, the choice between lump sum and annuity, more forms than I expected, more signatures than I had signed in my entire life, more notarized copies than seemed reasonable for one person to need. At one point, I joked to Renata that I had checked more boxes that week than I had in 11 years of inventory work. She laughed for the first time since I had met her. Then she told me, only half joking, that most of her clients did not make it through the paperwork phase with their sense of humor intact. After long conversations with Renata and a financial advisor, she recommended I chose the lump sum. The advisor's name was Priscilla Yang. She was calm, methodical, and specialized in sudden wealth clients. During our first 2 meetings, she spent almost no time telling me what to do with money. Instead, she asked me questions about what kind of life I actually wanted, not what kind of life people assumed lottery winners wanted. After taxes and the lump sum reduction, the final amount came to a little over $28 million. I sat in Priscilla's office the day the number was finalized and felt something I had not expected. Not euphoria, not wild joy. A quiet disbelief that slowly settled over the next few days into something steadier. Relief, mostly. Relief that a process that had almost gone catastrophically wrong had resolved the way it should have. I remember driving home that day and pulling into an empty parking lot for a few minutes, just to sit with the number before I had to become a person who answered phone calls, made dinner, and lived an ordinary evening again. I did not call anyone during those few minutes. I simply sat there and let it be real before I had to share it with anyone else. Outside the courthouse on the day of Curtis's sentencing, a local reporter who had picked up on the case asked whether I wanted to comment. I gave a short statement. I said I had tried to do the right thing at every step. I said I was grateful the system had ultimately worked the way it was supposed to. I said I hoped whoever had lost that earlier prize would eventually get an answer. I did not mention Curtis by name, beyond what was already in the public record. I did not need to. The court file could speak for itself. I drove home that afternoon with Tyler in the passenger seat. The radio was low. We were both mostly quiet in the particular way people are quiet after something difficult has finally fully ended.
As we turned onto my street, Tyler asked, "What are you going to do first?" I said, "Sleep. Properly, for the first time in over a month." We both laughed quietly for the first time in weeks. The months that followed did not become a completely different life, not right away. They became a steadier, fuller version of the life I already had. I gave my notice at the warehouse, but I did not leave abruptly. I worked the full 2 weeks. I trained my replacement properly. I left on good terms with people I had spent 11 years standing beside on a concrete floor. My supervisor hugged me on my last day, which surprised both of us, and told me she hoped I would come back sometime just to say hello. I told her I would, and I meant it. A few of my old coworkers chipped in for a small going-away gift. It was a framed photo of the loading dock of all things, with a note that said, "You checked our work for 11 years. Now go check out your new life." I cried a little in the break room. I had not expected that either. One of the younger guys on the floor, who had only worked there a few months, asked me half-jokingly if I would remember any of their names in a year. I told him I would. So far, I have. I bought a modest house, not extravagant, in a quiet neighborhood on the west side of Tulsa. It had a big kitchen and a yard with mature oak trees. It was the kind of house I had circled in real estate listings for years, without ever allowing myself to seriously consider it. I helped Tyler put a down payment on a small place of his own in Oklahoma City. He resisted accepting help at first, with the kind of pride I recognized, because I had lived with the same pride for most of my adult life. Eventually, he agreed, with a quiet gratitude that did not need many words. With Priscilla's careful guidance, I set up a trust for Tyler's future, structured so the money would support him without simply being handed to him all at once. I paid down Marlene's mortgage in Wichita as a gift. She refused at first, so I reminded her that she had driven 6 hours round trip just to sit at my kitchen table when I needed her most. I told her some debts are not really about money. She cried on the phone when I told her. Then she immediately tried to change the subject, which is exactly the kind of thing my sister would do. I also did something that surprised even me. I set up a small fund administered anonymously through the Oklahoma Lottery Commission's Consumer Protection Office, specifically to help track down and compensate winners whose smaller prizes had been mishandled or disputed over the years. The kind of cases too small to attract attorneys like Renata. The kind of thing that might have happened to the original $4,000 winner Curtis had defrauded. Eventually, I learned that the reopened investigation had identified that winner. She was a retired school teacher in her 70s. For 2 years, she had genuinely believed she had simply misread her own numbers. When Director Schumacher's office finally located her and explained what had actually happened, she called me. Renata had passed along that I was willing to be contacted. We talked for nearly an hour. She did not ask me for anything. She only wanted to say thank you, in her words, for not letting it happen twice. She also told me, almost as an afterthought, that she had kept the original losing numbers taped inside a kitchen drawer for 2 years. A small, private reminder of what she thought had simply been bad luck. She told me she planned to throw it away that evening. As for Curtis Dunlap, I heard about his situation only through occasional updates Renata passed along. The case had technically concluded, but she stayed in informal contact with the district attorney's office because of her role in surfacing it. He served his full sentence, rather than receiving a reduction given the pattern established by the earlier case. His 2 children went to live with his sister during his incarceration. I learned that with quiet, complicated sadness, not satisfaction. His permanent ban from lottery retail work meant that whatever he did afterward, it would not be behind a convenience store counter again. I did not feel triumphant hearing any of it. Mostly I felt the weight of understanding that his children had lost something too, through no fault of their own. A cost no court proceeding could fully account for. A cost I never stopped thinking about, even years later. Priscilla once asked me during one of our quarterly check-ins whether the money had changed how I thought about that Friday evening at the Quick Stop. The coffee, the candy bar, the impulse ticket. I thought about it before answering.
Then I told her no.
I think about that night the way I think about most ordinary moments that turn out to matter more than we know at the time.
I was not trying to change my life that night. I was tired and wanted a coffee. The rest of it happened to be sitting there waiting. She nodded in the way people do when an answer sounds exactly like the person giving it. Sometimes I still think about how close the whole thing came to disappearing entirely. I think about a single security threshold in a lottery terminal, something neither Curtis nor I had ever heard of before that week, standing between the truth and a story that would have ended with me never knowing I had won anything at all. I do not dwell on it with anxiety. I dwell on it with steady gratitude. Doing careful, unglamorous things had been enough. Documentation, patience, refusing to be talked out of what I knew I had seen, refusing to let someone else's fear become my version of the truth. A $2 ticket changed my life. But so did 3 words that almost made me give up before I had even started. This isn't possible.
Here is what I learned. Document everything. Trust your own eyes over a stranger's reassurance. Never let someone else's panic talk you into rewriting what actually happened. I did not win because I was lucky twice. I won because I refused to let the first no be the last word.